Hey! Day 2 of DEF CON. I still have my voice. Do you guys still have your voices? Not after Ravi tonight. Okay. Let's get started talking about Web3 infrastructure and the Web3 stack. Something I really like about working at this early stage of Web3 is we're actually talking about the infrastructure and the stack and what matters and all that, along with the application layer, and kind of not ignoring it and just building. So before we get started, why don't we do a quick round of introductions and tell us about what you all do.
Thank you, Maggie. Hey everyone, my name's John. I do protocol research and specification at Fuel Labs, building the Fuel protocol, which means I mostly help people fix broken CI workflows. On occasion, I approve some PRs.
Hi everyone, my name is Eva, Director of the Graph Foundation of the Graph. Most of what I do is help grow the ecosystem, grants, coordinate core devs, and a lot of strategy.
I'm Nader Dabit. I'm the founder of DeveloperDAO, and I work in developer relations with Abe and Lynn's protocol, and I focus, most of my career has been on developer education.
Thank you, and my name is Maggie Love, and I'm co-founder and director of ecosystem and partnerships for Web3 Cloud, and we build the compute and storage infrastructure for Web3 protocols. So we're here to talk about Web3 infrastructure today. So what is something that developers, software applications should be thinking about when they're building a Web3 application when it comes to infrastructure?
I guess what qualifies as infrastructure? Is it anything that is outside of, after you deploy your contract, will that qualify as infrastructure?
That's a great question. I think how deep in the stack is infrastructure, or how high in the stack is infrastructure?
Sure. I guess I would personally say that anything that is outside of, or after I deploy the contract, would qualify as infrastructure in some way or another. Right? There's things like RPC or data providers, right? But there's also things like how do I ensure that my contract is even audited or verified or whatever. So I think one thing that may be important, I mean, these guys are probably also going to talk about other important things, but one thing that I particularly think is important is the auditability and the transparency around contract source verification, right? And also being able to do things like run contracts locally and being able to verify information. A lot of things that happen in the Ethereum space rely on zero clients and other clients that don't really have any security around the actual results of things, and also centralized verification of source code through Etherscan, which is obviously a very great service, but I think we could be doing much better on the front of enabling more decentralization on the front of users being able to verify themselves that contracts are what they say they are, and the results of some transaction execution are in fact what centralized service providers or distributed service providers say they are.
Yeah, I think it's a good question of what is infrastructure, because in crypto one could consider economic infrastructure, not just the actual stack. So thinking even about the hacks that happened yesterday, a lot of them were not actual problems. It was maybe a lack of decentralization, lack of liquidity, all these other economic inefficiencies. More generally, I would agree that we at the Graph believe that every part of the stack needs to be decentralized. And at the moment, that might seem sort of overkill, but we've seen Tornado Cash. We've even heard people like Danny Ryan yesterday talk about resilience and how if they're not coming after us now, they will. And so really being considerate about where are those central points of failure in your stack today, and what is the path to decentralize further, because we know most protocols are not quite finished yet, but being quite honest about that, will make sure that your app is sustainable long term.
Yeah, so one of the things that I worked with actually with Eva at the Graph was we had one or two people that were focused on understanding the different pieces of the Web3 tech stack and all the different, I would say, components that you would need to build out the types of applications that people want to build. And I think that what we learned was that there's almost like a spectrum of decentralization, because even the most decentralized networks and protocols out there often have a point of centralization somewhere, but everyone's kind of wanting to move to being decentralized. So you kind of have more like a progressive decentralization where you start off and then you kind of move more and more in that direction. And from the perspective of a developer, most of the people that I talk to want to build an app. And at first, they're just kind of overwhelmed with all the things that are out there. But then they start diving in and they start understanding, okay, I need storage, I need an API, I need a smart contract. And therefore, you do have like all of these different protocols that are trying to fill these needs. Some of them, by nature, are more decentralized. So a blockchain is obviously decentralized. But if you wanted to build out something like compute or maybe an API, those things are a lot more challenging to build. So to me, I would just say any service or maybe service that you need in order to build out a blockchain or maybe a decentralized application could be considered a Web3 piece of the Web3 stack.
Thank you. Eva brought up a really good point that, at the graph, they believe all parts of the stack should be decentralized. And then also we're talking about here that in the beginning, to achieve scale, it can be hard to start off totally decentralized. Eva, and if others have an opinion as well, how do you incentivize decentralization at those different layers?
That's a great question. I would say first and foremost, there has to be a degree of altruism, and maybe that is something we can assume given that we're all here. It is very early in crypto. Ethereum is several years old, but we're still not there yet. And so everyone is building for this vision that, we're not really actually quite pressured to do this yet. Maybe in regions like Latin America, we're not actually convincing people of this reason to use Ethereum because there's actual corruption everywhere. But in other countries, we're still kind of convincing them why we need decentralization. So there's a degree of altruism here. But I think also, like, Tornado Cash is one example that is so extreme that I think it's shocked everyone, where we're now seeing, in our legal analysis that jurisdictions are coming after dApps for the smallest thing. It's not even related to OFAC necessarily or illegal activity. It's, were you using a US-based social media company? Or did you have people, based in this country? And so it really proves that there are going to be many people coming after you for any reason. And governments are powerful. They can try and claim, again, for whatever reason. We've seen this happen actually, I think, in the Tezos case a few years ago in New York, where there were some ridiculous claims made against Tezos and they stood. And so that is the threat, really. If you're actually thinking about your dApp existing longer than 1 year, longer than 10 years, or lasting 100 years, you have to start thinking about that decentralization now, because by the time that you need it, it'll be too late. So I would say even that altruism right now is actually maybe slightly capitalist because you're thinking about your long-term incentives.
I think that's really great, and actually Tech from Gnosis Chain, if you know him, just released a paper on decentralization, and there is a specific term for what Eva was talking about. I can't remember it, but we think about, there's like a tragedy of the commons in the decentralization space, a bit, even though we are working on decentralized technology. So I would just suggest checking it out. Jonathan, you mentioned right now, in order to verify a smart contract, you have to go to Etherscan, centralized block explorer. Are you seeing any other type of block explorers or anything else coming up that's more distributed?
Yeah, so there's things people can do. For example, a lot of more classical package and binary distribution mechanisms don't use things like digital signatures. If you remember, Python one doesn't. We live in a space that heavily uses things like cryptography, hashing, digital signatures, and so on. There's no reason that you can't have a distributed registry that acts the same as centralized registries do today for both contracts and libraries and other components of the stack, even front ends, even audit reports and so on, test cases, all of these things can be sent over to distributed package registries, and through the use of things like digital signatures, they can be authenticated. The Google Play Store, I'm sure the Apple Store uses similar schemes, right? Every package that you upload to the Google Play Store must be signed with your developer key, which means that users who download your application once then can avoid an attack where someone else pretends to be the developer or things like this, right? They make good use of public key cryptography. That's literally what it was designed for. And these kind of things should be used more because it's literally just data with some signatures attached, and that unlocks a whole new ecosystem of authenticated package registries.
Okay, sounds good. Nader, you mentioned in the beginning a bit, you're a new Web3 developer, you just did Bogotá, you hacked some stuff together, and then you actually have to get started building your application. So what are different considerations they have to take into account, or different tools they have to use to actually, get started now that they have a grant and they can start building their Web3 app?
Yeah, I think just understanding where all the different pieces fit in order to achieve an objective. So developers probably don't come here and they're like, oh, I want to understand maybe what is the best like layer 2 to use. Instead, they might say, I want to build an app that does this. So how do we kind of like get from that thought into the actual protocols that they need to understand, to build? So in the traditional tech world, we had these main components. You have like authentication, you have file storage, you have compute, you have these building blocks, and then with those building blocks, like maybe a database and API layer. With those building blocks, you can build like 99% of the types of apps, and then that other like 1 to 5% is just going to be maybe like some machine learning or whatever. And I think trying to conceptualize that into blockchain, into Web3, it seems to be extremely, extremely helpful. So most of the time when I've been able to kind of like try to help people understand what that looks like, that's been very, very valuable. So again, one of the things that was really great to work on at the Graph and Edge Node was this blog post that was an effort between me and a bunch of other people that was called Defining the Web3 Stack. And we tried to kind of break that down and make it very approachable, because there are literally thousands of different protocols that are out there. And a new developer that comes into this ecosystem becomes not only like overwhelmed, but intimidated and maybe scared to build anything. So trying to kind of distill that down into a lower barrier to entry, and then once they kind of like get their foot in the door, they might then go out and explore some of the things that were outside of what we had listed there. So I think that's a great place to start. That blog post is still up, and I think it's still relevant.
I definitely read that blog post.
I just want to add, I think we're at the point where people need to consider what the protocol does versus what the users are going to do. And I think a lot of the dApps today are still very one-to-one. So if you're bridging your assets to Optimism, we end up giving the user that same experience. We tell the user to bridge their assets to Optimism. But the reality is, like today, we don't know when we're transferring money between banks. Like I don't know I'm sending it to BMO or TD Bank. I just know I'm sending money. And so we need to start separating what is it again that the protocol does versus what should the user know the protocol does, and build better dApps that enable that experience.
Yeah, so a point that's maybe not directly answering the question, but is related to what Nader was saying, which is that there's kind of this ironic stuck between a rock and a hard place, which is that if you want to kind of maybe fully embody the ethos of quote-unquote decentralization, a lot of the developer and to a certain extent user documentation that has been created over the past many years for Ethereum development has been distributed across many teachers. And this has the kind of ironic issue that a lot of this documentation is not maintained, is not necessarily accurate, which means that over time you have this weird thing that happens that it becomes potentially harder for new developers to actually learn how to write contracts and dApps for Ethereum, because there's just an ever-increasing number of tutorials that aren't maintained, and that some of them are excellent and some of them are not so excellent. And for a new developer that comes in, they may not know, since they aren't Web3 native, right? They're a brand new developer entering the space. They don't know which ones are good or not. So you kind of have this ironic like push and pull where the way of getting the most effective developer and user onboarding documentation flows is through having like a more centralized, curated registry of documentation that is maintained, that is high quality, that's comprehensive, but that maybe, if you're going for the whole let's decentralize everything, maybe it doesn't fully align with that ethos. So it's a very weird stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to onboarding new developers into this space in particular.
And is this where? I think this one's up. Okay. And to that end, when we're, if you're a new developer, like within storage, within, RPC or querying, within, all these different, within layer twos, like if I'm a new developer, like how do I choose, like how do I even begin to know what's the right infrastructure or stack for me? Where should I deploy? Where should I store? How should I get data from the blockchain? Without necessarily dropping products, but you know. Yeah, so like how do I, like, you know, if there's all these choices out there, how do I actually choose what's the best for me to deploy my app on when there's so many choices within each of these buckets of infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I don't think there is like a right answer. I think that it depends on which ecosystem has showed you the best, you know, because a lot of them, the actual quality of the service is not that big of a difference between the different options. Depending on, you know, he's nodding his head. But yeah, depending on what you're doing, it's not going to matter a whole lot whether you deploy on Polygon or Optimism or Arbitrum when you're just like playing with the hello world, you know, you're just like testing things out. But what ends up happening is you often get involved in that ecosystem early on. So like trying to get those early developers is actually pretty valuable because those people will make connections, they'll build relationships in those areas. Now, on the other hand, there are certain protocols that are like the only ones that do certain things, in my opinion. So for instance, like IPFS is like, doesn't really have a lot of competitors, in my opinion, for doing the types of file storage that it does. Arweave, the Graph, like all of these I think are standalone, whereas there are dozens of layer 2s that are out there and things like that. So yeah, I think often there isn't like a right or wrong answer when you're just getting started, but maybe down the road when you want to scale, then that's when you have the issues.
Yeah, so I guess in my opinion, I mean, I reflect a lot of your sentiment that there's no necessarily right answer, especially not one that can come from like a third party. But in my opinion, the best way to figure out what the best technology is first of all, figure out what the best technology is for you and your application and your needs and your users' needs. Because you may have different needs than other people, and not everything is optimal for everything, right? There's different trade-offs. Some things might be better for NFTs, something that might be better for DeFi, some things might be better for simple payments. It's about figuring out what the best technology and tools are for your particular needs. And the only way to really get to, or get closer to the optimal or ideal answer to that is to experiment. It's to not get stuck in the trap of, oh, this is the first thing I've used, it must be the best. It's keeping an open mind and exploring new technologies, experimenting with them, and seeing if they are in fact better or worse for your particular use case, and constantly evolving your use of the technology and the tools.
I would add that there's a lot of social factors involved. So again, going back to liquidity, you know, if you have a layer 2 that has no liquidity, then it's actually way more inferior than whatever alternative you're using. So taking into consideration what are the specific needs of your dApp, sort of like John said. But I would say it even goes as low as philosophy or smart contracts. So, you know, we are not seeing every DeFi app use the same layer 2. It's just not happening. Everyone has made different choices, largely for those trade-offs. Maybe there's ecosystem reasons, maybe there's smart contract reasons. But I believe like we should not expect that there would be generalized solutions. And I don't see a future where one L2 is necessarily winning a giant category.
Another.
So you believe in a multi-chain world?
We at the Graph do. We're chain agnostic.
Yes, we want lots of different protocols. So when we're thinking about, you know, using decentralized services, let's say, they're sometimes not as efficient or proficient, right? Like this is why things like Alchemy and Infura started off centralized to really be more performant. For some of these decentralized infrastructure pieces, what do you think some of the challenges are in recruiting developers and users when they are less performant, or what do they have to overcome to, you know, compete with the centralized versions of their counterparts in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I can start with this one. I mean, decentralization is definitely a journey. You know, we at the Graph are very in tune with this. We started with a hosted service as well and are launching the network. It's definitely very, very hard. And I would say part of it is the increased complexity of coordination as you're supporting more dApps and chains. So the minute you add a new chain or a new sort of mechanism, it completely changes the way that the network participants behave. And, you know, being in Ethereum for some time, I used to also think, hey, why is it taking so long? And you realize, you know, the merge took so long because it had to because it's so complex. There's so many potential challenges. So I would just say, to DApp developers to be patient. Like everyone working on a protocol is working their asses off. It takes a long time. But in the interim, we're trying to create solutions that meet your needs immediately. So getting that feedback, making sure we have hybrid solutions. I think creating compromise is really important on this journey to decentralization because we're not going to be at the end for some time. And even Ethereum isn't quite finished.
I guess the question might be on my end, like, what is the purpose of decentralization? Like, what if you had to identify one thing, would it be censorship resistance? And if you say yes to that, then if you build a protocol that is censorship resistant, is it okay to build layers on top of that that do have centralization in order to improve the user experience? And that, in my opinion, I would say yes, just because, like, we are talking about in the last talk, onboarding the next whatever, thousands or millions or billions of users, should we say, oh, like, fuck those users for now, we're not decentralized yet, we're gonna wait 10 years? Or if we can build the base layer that is decentralized, but we can provide a better user experience today while not compromising on decentralization, should we do that? And I think that seems to be where we're moving right now.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer, right? There's trade-offs, like there are trade-offs in everything. Although I do think that there's kind of an increasing acknowledgement over time, especially in recent months, that there is very concrete and very real value in users and potentially applications owning their data or their assets or their ecosystem in ways that you can't get out of purely centralized protocols or centralized infrastructure providers, I should say. So I think at least we're heading in the right direction, that there is increasing awareness that this thing is in fact important and that we shouldn't solely rely on centralized providers for everything for all time, and that people are moving towards decentralizing what have formerly been more centralized protocols. And big kudos to the Graph for decentralizing their hosting. It's a very big step towards decentralizing infrastructure.
Okay, and we are out of time basically. So to you, Nader mentioned censorship resistance. If we think about what's happening in Iran with the women protesting and getting locked out of the internet, I think we can all agree that for many philosophical reasons, decentralization is important too. But what about decentralized infrastructure is the most important to you? Like, why should people be caring about this?
Yeah, I would say not only censorship resistance, but access. I think that's what I always pinpoint blockchains down to is nobody is able to control your access. So speaking about Iran, having APIs or storage or opportunities for people to share information. Censorship starts maybe at the Web2 social media level, but if we are able to provide opportunities for those people to speak up and share that information on a blockchain or API, whatever that might be, that can be one step closer. So it's not only about censorship resistance to me, it's about being able to access the world's utilities. And just because one jurisdiction says you shouldn't doesn't mean that that should be the case.
Obviously, I agree that censorship resistance and stuff is important. Maybe I'll bring up one point that is maybe less intense, but it's the simple thing of, I don't want to say owning your data, because that was always a weird expression. It's not like you own your data, but rather you control who gets access to your data, which is slightly different, right? Because if you've given out your data, you don't own it anymore. If you want to say that, once you've given it out, you've given it out. But it's more like controlling who you give it out to. Through increasing or rather decreasing usage of things like client-server models, where there's centralized platforms, centralized ecosystems such as Twitter or YouTube that were brought up in the previous talk, that are centralized platforms that really control the brand or the thing that you've built. If you're a Twitter influencer or YouTube creator, right? Like those platforms really control the thing that you've built and spent your time on. But more decentralized platforms allow you to do things that are more peer-to-peer, more client-side, and allow you to control who has access to your data, which seems like a fairly, maybe not so interesting point in the face of all the horrible things happening in the world. But it does have like potentially longer-term ramifications. We've seen there's a lot of issues with simple things like rigging elections through manipulating information. And these kind of things do have longer-term consequences that are maybe a little more subtle, but that could hopefully be alleviated through more decentralized infrastructure.
I guess the reason I mentioned censorship resistance was that, all of these amazing things that you all are talking about are only possible if the protocol itself exists and is healthy. And what we saw with like Tornado Cash and all the discussions that ended up happening after that around all the different players that would be taking part in making Ethereum itself continue to exist as we've known it, would possibly be compromised if we started seeing censorship at the protocol level. So I think like all the things that you all are talking about are obviously extremely important. But I guess my main thoughts were like, as long as the protocol exists, we can do all these things. So that's kind of my main thoughts there. So.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is a panel of amazing builders and thought leaders, so I want to give them a chance to tell you all where you can find them as they put out great content on all these topics.
Sure, so you can follow me on Twitter at @jadler0. You can follow the work that we're doing at Fuel Labs at fuellabs_, or you can go to our website, fuel.network. There, if you want to learn more about the protocol, or if you want to learn how to build on the protocol or use it, there's various links, so please check it out.
You can find me on Twitter as well, Eva Beylin, and if you're interested in learning how to transfer your subgraph from the hosted service to the network, visit our Discord or our Docs, and we can give you one-on-one help there.
I'm on Lin's protocol at nader.lens. I'm also on Twitter at DABIT3, and that's me.
Great, thank you. You can find me on Twitter at MaggieLove_. Thanks so much for the conversation, everyone. Have a great rest of your DEF CON.
Thank you.